She needs me. It's not as if she were a maniac, a raving thing. She just goes a little mad sometimes. We all go a little mad sometimes. Haven't you? This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Mel,
And I'm Lisa.
and this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. Join us as we check into a vacation from hell, the second episode in our new series all about the horror of the motel. Today's episode is all about the one that started it all, Psycho.
All right. Yeah, we are talking Psycho on this podcast episode. Matt is not with us. We miss you, Matt. Hurry back. But I'm going to give us just a little rundown on the film. I'm assuming most people who would listen to this podcast are familiar with it, but in case you're not, uh, Psycho is a 1960 horror film directed by Alfred Hitchcock. It was based on the novel of the same name by Robert Bloch, which came out the year before. Bloch, just if the name sounds familiar, he was a contributor to magazines like Weird Tales, among many other things. Um, he got the idea for Psycho from, I guess we can say, kind of loosely inspired by the real life serial killer Ed Gein. And so that kind of like plays into the mythos that is this film. All right, this film stars Anthony Perkins as the titular Psycho. It also has the OG Scream Queen, Janet Leigh. So, a few things about this, all right, that I just think is fascinating and I love talking about. It's one of my favorite horror facts. Um, Janet Leigh is the mother of Jamie Lee Curtis. So, of course, she's kind of the OG final girl in the Halloween franchise. And yes, I'm quite aware, listeners, you can squabble. Janet Leigh might not be the original Scream Queen. That may go to somebody like Fay Wray. I mean, there were people before her. Same thing with Jamie Lee Curtis. She was not the only final girl or the first final girl, but I think she's the one we often think of when we think about who was the first final girl in the Halloween franchise. But you may not know this: Anthony Perkins, the Psycho of Psycho, is the father of Osgood Perkins. So he's an actor and director of horror films. He's done some of my favorite horror films, but probably his most famous is his most recent one, Longlegs. So we are really talking about some like horror royal families here when we talk about this Psycho. So there's a lot to talk about. I will say this is also considered to be one of the first slashers. Now, again, it's not the first slasher. I think on this podcast, maybe a couple of years ago, we had Grady Hendrix on to talk about what might have been the first slasher when we talked about the pre-code horror film. I believe it was called 13 Women. Now I'm second guessing myself, but well before this. But a lot of people consider this, if not the first slasher, then at least the horror film that really kind of changed what horror looked like on the screen. So that's just a little bit about the film Psycho. There was, and I'll just say we're not going to talk about it because I, to this day, don't fully understand why they did it. There were three sequels uh, for this film, and then there was a shot-for-shot remake by Gus Van Sant in 1998 that starred Vince Vaughn. And it's literally the same film. It's shot for shot. It's just different, a different director and different actors in the roles. Kind of interesting to watch just from a film perspective, but also I don't know why we needed that. And then there was the Bates Motel TV show that served as a prequel. So yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. Mel, I'm going to turn it over to you for some first impressions.
I am happy to take it and offer my first impressions. So, listeners, I actually did some digging, and I think we did talk a little bit about Psycho when we talked about preserved corpses like a long, long time ago, but we didn't talk about the movie as a whole. And I don't think because it was a shorter episode, I'm not even sure if we did like impressions. So this is my third time. I don't know. I feel like it's been more. I'm gonna say this is my third time watching the movie, but I feel like I probably watched it a couple more times. I watched many of Hitchcock's movies, and there was a time several years ago where I was working my way through a bunch, and I'm pretty sure I watched it then, and I'd already watched it once at that point. And so let me see my impressions. There were a couple things I had kind of forgotten about. I had forgotten that kind of frenetic beginning with the all the movement on the screen before it kind of unveils the title of the film. I had not forgotten one of the things I find really interesting about the movie, and that is that it's almost like two movies put into one. It starts out as like a thriller where you have this Marion Crane stealing the $40,000 because, yeah, well, first it opens with her and her lover having an assignation in a hotel, which is interesting when the whole thing kind of revolves around a motel. And he has a lot of debts. And so she steals this $40,000 thinking that she can take it to him and they can kind of fix his problems and be together. And so it's almost like a road trip type thing where you have this woman who does something that people probably wouldn't expect of her and is headed off, and the cops are suspicious of her. And then appears to be our main character, and she kind of is, but then she's kind of like ghosted from the movie. So the movie is about investigating her murder because, like, an hour or so in, she's murdered in that iconic shower scene, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Because even before we hit record, we were already talking about all the different shifts that happen with that scene. So that's one of the things I find most interesting about the movie is that halfway through it shifts. So the main character's gone, and now we've got the main character's sister and the main character's former lover. Well, I don't know. I mean, not former because she left him, but because she died, and the private investigator. And they're all kind of investigating the motel keeper, Norman Bates. And of course, he's got his whole past. And we already know we have a pretty good idea that he had something to do with her murder. If nothing else, at that point, we know he covered it up. And I think one of the other things I find really interesting um, about this movie is something that I think you actually put in the notes, Lisa. You mentioned the gothic aspects of this. So yes, we've got like a thriller that turns into a horror movie slash mystery. I love the melded genres, but then you've also got some gothic in there too, because this place is extremely isolated, and it's also kind of a domestic space, especially for Norman Bates, who has been around this motel for a while. And the house where he and his mother, kind of waving my hand around at that, live, is a very American Gothic looking house. I mean, it's almost like, even though we're on the West Coast, it has a little bit of a New England feel to it, I guess. I mean, it's basically like this house, haunted looking house on a hill looking over this motel. So you have the public facing part of what they're doing, which is giving people like a home for the night. But then you have their own private home space behind, which is where all this horror is and this hidden that gradually becomes revealed. And so this time watching it, I when I saw that you had put that in the notes, Lisa, I was like, yes, exactly. Because I was thinking that the whole time. It's like, it's almost like the movie shifted again every time somebody looked behind the motel and saw the big kind of Gothic house structure. But the fact that this is a motel that the highway moved away from and nobody comes down and stays there anymore also gives it that kind of isolated Gothic feel, and connects it to the house in some interesting ways. And it also just, on the level of being a murder mystery, or well, a serial killer, it gives the isolation that would be needed to do this sort of thing. And people might stop looking for these women because it would be so easy to kind of overlook this place, or just say, oh, these women were moving through, we're not going to follow up on this. So, yeah, I think those are a few of my first impressions. I always love what's done every time I watch it. I love what's done with the music in the movie. The way the music works with the action and the scenes is just spot on and adds so much to it. But At the risk of getting too far ahead of myself and into our discussion, Lisa, what are some of your impressions? I'm sure you've watched this movie a few times.
Yeah, I have. I've watched this one many times, like really too many to count. I mean, I really like Hitchcock. I always feel like that's kind of a problematic thing to say sometimes because I don't know, sometimes when you talk to certain people about Hitchcock films, it can really elicit an eye roll for how deep like people go into it. But I don't know, I do. I've enjoyed a lot of his films and um this is probably I would say this is probably my second favorite Hitchcock film. It's my favorite, just to be clear, is Rope. I love that one.
I was about to ask you. Yeah.
Yeah, I love Rope. No, I love Psycho, and Psycho I think is so exciting to me in the just looking at it in the sense of how it fits into horror history, like the history of the horror film, because you really do see a shift there. Um, and the way it pushes boundaries in ways that I'm still sometimes surprised he was allowed to do that. So yeah, I mean, I have seen it. I've seen it. I've seen it a lot. I've seen each of the like sequels at least once. Honestly could not tell you much about them. I do remember one where like Norman Bates calls into some sort of like phone radio show um and is like detailing his crimes or something like that. It's been a long time, so I may be getting that detail wrong, but I don't remember much about the, the sequels, but I do love this film. And yeah, so some of the things that like he could like Hitchcock was kind of getting away with. I think the idea of like the violence in this film, and even though you really don't see a lot, of course, we're going to talk about the shower scene more in depth. I do think it's one of those films that's very, very scary given what it does show. The fact that it it at least showed what looked like, and we can talk about later like how he filmed it and stuff, but in the shower scene, when she Marion Crane is getting stabbed, it looks like we are watching like the blade make contact with her skin. And today, I think in what year are we in? 2025. That doesn't seem like it's pushing that much, but I think for 1960s, especially considering that the Hays Code was still a thing, it was still being enacted, although it was diminishing. Um, people weren't caring about it quite as much. It wasn't as strictly enforced as it had been in the past. But to have something like this um, shown on camera, I think he really was pushing the boundaries, especially when we think about other films that were also like equally scary but didn't show as much, that leaned more towards like psychological horror. Something like The Haunting, for instance. So I don't know. I think that's fascinating. I love the way gender is kind of played with in this film, because of course, and again, yes, we're gonna spoil it. It was a 1960s film. We're gonna spoil this one, but with the big reveal in the end that mother is kind of this figure who looms over the place, which is also I think a very gothic thing. We can talk about Mel. But it's not just like the house and the setting, but also this character of mother that looms large. And then we find out that Norman Bates is mother, and he's been kind of taking on that role. So this idea of gender that's been going, it kind of pushes the line of like sexuality in a way that I'm surprised for the year. Of course, he already did that with Rope a bit. It was made in 1949, so 11 years earlier, when the Hays Code was much stronger and the censors were paying more attention. But a lot of the like homosexual subtext to that film was really glossed over. Um, but the play that it was based on, it made it very clear what was going on. So I think that I don't know, like the people who were paying attention knew what it was about, but it was enough for the censors. So, and I think he was able to even push that a little bit further. And I also want to say one thing too that I thought about this time watching it. We do have the whole you mentioned it opens on Marion Crane and it seems to be her movie. Um and I'm always surprised, Mel, too, when I watch it, like how much happens before we even get to the Bates Motel in this film, because it's essentially like this kind of crime thriller caper where she's having an affair and she's stealing money and she's going on the run. And it seems to be this entirely different film until she arrives at the Bates Motel and gets murdered. And then we're in a horror film. So it kind of shifts. But I was thinking about that to me, I feel like we could not have had Drew Barrymore in Scream without Marion Crane in this film, because that was one of the big things, listeners, if you're younger than us in the 90s, when we all watched Scream, the first time in the theater, we thought Drew Barrymore was going to be the star of this film because she was on all the posters and everybody was talking about Drew Barrymore in this film. And she was arguably the most famous one in the cast. And so when when she died in that first like sequence, it was quite shocking. And I feel like, I mean, I wasn't alive. I'm not that old. I wasn't alive to see this one in the theater when it was on its first run. But I feel like that it would have been a very similar kind of switch for the audience because Hitchcock he was very adamant about keeping this film's plot a secret. Even as it was, audiences were going in, he was like, when you leave, don't tell people what the twist is.
Yes, Lisa. I think it's good that, well, everything that you said was really interesting, and I agree. But I think it's good that you mentioned the fact that Hitchcock was kind of pushing the envelope on some stuff in this movie, from surprising people with the loss of who we thought was the main character to the. We'll have to talk about it later, but I guess you could describe it as like gender nonconformity, or kind of the psychological relationship that they kind of limb out for Norman and his mother. Um, and then also the idea of the violence in the movie. And that's one of the things I think we should probably shift to, and that is the infamous shower scene. So I'm sure, listeners, you've probably seen this movie. If you haven't seen Psycho, you've probably seen the infamous shower scene because it's just something that's pretty well known in pop culture. Um, so one of the things that I kind of thought was interesting when we were getting ready for this episode is I was reading an article from the BBC Music magazine, and they were talking about how the composer, who I believe he composed for, what was it, nine Hitchcock movies. Apparently, Hitchcock had not necessarily wanted music during the shower scene, and the composer, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce his last name. It's a German last name, so I'm thinking Bernard Herrmann, but it could be Bernard Herrmann. But basically, he was like, "No, I think we're going to need some music for this." So he wrote it, and they ended up using it in the movie. And so you have this. I thought it was so interesting how there was almost a chance that iconic um screeching sound in the music that always happens when Norman pops out to kill somebody might not have been a thing. Again, even people who haven't watched this movie know when they hear that sound, like what is supposed to be happening, or kind of have a an awareness of that. So just the scene itself is so iconic. It's also terrifying. I mean, I think we've talked about this in other places as well, but when you're thinking about motel horror, I think in particular, she's by herself. She's in the middle of nowhere. It's been raining. She barely knows where she is until Norman tells her she's actually pretty close to where Sam is, where she's trying to get to, but she still decides to stay the night. And Norman is being a little odd, and you can tell by her reactions that she's not quite sure what's going on here. And some of the things that we talked about when we talked about motel horror are happening, like his ability to kind of be a peeping Tom and look through the wall and watch her, know what she's doing in the room. He puts her in that room for that purpose. And so, the idea of an invasion of that space, the private space, a hotel room is a bedroom and a bathroom. And so she's in the shower. She is taking the shower. She's in a very kind of vulnerable state. And it's the innkeeper who has the key to get in, right? So it's not someone like forcing their way in, it's someone who can come in. And so that beginning of it where she's showering and you have the clear shower curtain and you see the figure coming up to the curtain is just like, no matter how many times I've seen that, either from watching the movie or when I'm watching a documentary or something, or I just see it on TV as a reference. It's so creepy. I mean, it's so creepy. Like, if you're alone in a space like that and someone you can't hear if someone snuck in or whatever, and then to her, she just knows that the curtain is ripped aside and then she's getting stabbed. And then, like you said, Lisa, you really can't ever see the violence that's happening to her. It's shot in such a way that it's not showing too much of her body for that time period, but it's like just enough. It's like there's a lot that's shown, but there's a lot that's left to your imagination. So after you've watched it, you kind of feel like you saw more than you actually did, which I think is kind of the trick of that scene, or the beauty of that scene and the way that he did it. So yeah, those were some of the things I thought were really interesting about that particular scene and how it was set up. I feel like those visuals and the addition of the music just added so much, and just the idea of, like, if you put yourself in her place, it's just, like, so horrifying. And then, you also have to know that nobody knows where you are, and so that's terrifying too in that respect. But Lisa, I do want to pass it off to you because I know that you wanted to talk about some of the different shots that were done, and you had other thoughts on the shower scene you wanted to share.
Yeah, I think this scene is so absolutely iconic. I remember the first time I saw it, and I was young-ish when I saw it. I don't know if I was like middle school, maybe early high school. I don't know. Let's say middle school. When I saw this film, and it's one of those that I don't know. Sometimes these like older black and white films, you feel like you can kind of give yourself a pass on, like it won't be too scary to me because I've seen scarier things. I think I fall into that trap a lot, and I remember just feeling the chill down to my bones watching this scene. And I think for me, a big part of it was, I mean, it is the isolation of the motel, right? And Mel, you were talking about that and how effective that setting is, because you already see her in this like desperate situation. And then she ends up in this motel and she feels uncomfortable. So I think as the audience, we're picking up on that, when she's talking to Norman and things don't seem quite right. And, it's this is a little bit of a weird place, but it's the scene when she thinks she's alone. And it's how voyeuristic the scene feels that I think really got to me. Um, that felt so realistic to me because, I mean, that a shower is such, a vulnerable place to be, and a hotel room already is. We talked about that on our last episode, and I think it was Matt who brought up the fact that, like, you're already in this space that isn't really your space, so you're not familiar with it, but in most hotel rooms, there's only one way out. And then that's kind of, like, compounded when you get into the bathroom, and so it's already such a vulnerable place for her to be in as a woman traveling alone. But when we see, because we see first, like, Norman watching her, and we realize what he's doing when he like moves the picture and can like look through the hole in the wall. And that, oh my gosh, that even now it makes me want to shudder because it's just, I think that's everybody's like, especially women's, but like a really deep fear. And there have been a couple of horror movies set in hotels that I'm not going to remember the name of off the top of my head that play with this device, not as well, obviously, as like Hitchcock and Psycho, but play with the idea of like being watched when you're in a hotel room or being like videotaped even while you're in a hotel room. Um, but then even this, when she's in the shower, the different angles that Hitchcock is able to get on her also feels like we, the audience, are like invading her personal space. And so it's that extra like layer of not just intimacy, but of crossing the boundaries of intimacy that I think make this scene so terrifying. Um, and I think for me, the first time that I saw it, that's what stuck out to me was this sense of this woman's space being completely violated. Um, Ew, even now, I just kinda wanna shudder thinking about it. It's like I have to turn that part of my brain off every time I get into a hotel shower now because of this scene. Like, oh no, who's gonna be looking at me, right? But I do wanna talk about a couple of other things too that I just think are fun from a behind the scenes standpoint. Um, there is a documentary called 7852 Hitchcock Shower Scene. It came out in 2017. Um, there are tons of directors talking about this. Guillermo del Toro comments a lot on this scene. Oz Perkins, Anthony Perkins' son, who again is also a horror director, talks about this one a lot. And so if you're interested in it and you want to waste a little bit of your time, I highly recommend it. It doesn't sound like it would be very fascinating, just like spending 2 hours dissecting one scene, but like it's worth it. I think with this one in particular. Um, but a few fun facts that I found. I love Foley. I love how they do Foley in films. So when they were getting the knife effects for this and they wanted to get that good sound, they actually used a cassava melon and stabbed a knife into it to make sure to get that good kind of knife stabbing sound because it was like just hollow enough to make the good sound. The blood was not stage blood. It was actually Hershey's syrup because it was being filmed in black and white, and that was gonna show up, I guess, as a more realistic blood color. Um, so they used syrup for that. And the soundtrack that Hitchcock, of course, didn't want was a combination of violins, violas, and cellos, to get that really staccato screeching sound to it. Um, I love hearing that kind of stuff, hearing about it. But in the scene where we think we see her be stabbed, because this is something you were talking about, Mel, um, how we don't see as much as we think we see is kind of left to the imagination. That part was filmed, it was shot backwards and then played backwards on the film. So it was actually a prop knife that Hitchcock, dipped a little bit of chocolate syrup on the very tip of it and kind of pressed it just a little bit into her stomach and then pulled it. And so it was shot in reverse. So it looks like it's going in when really he was making the pulling motion out, which I don't know. I always find fascinating. That was one of the ways he could kind of get away with it. And then one of the scenes that always this kind of like cutaway, when she is stabbed and she falls to the floor, and then the camera cuts to the shower continuing to run, the like water continuing to run. That was another part that stuck out to me the first time I watched it because it felt very like final and lonely, if that makes sense, because it was just like you're watching this really horrific thing and it's very frantic, but then all of a sudden it's just water and it's like an empty shower. You know what I mean? To me it felt um I don't know, I felt the finality of her death in a way that a lot of horror movies don't linger on. A lot of horror movies are you see the dying, you see the killer wielding the knife or the axe or whatever the killer has, and then moving on to the next victim. It very rarely do you kind of stick there in the moments after to kind of let the death sink in, I guess, with the audience. And I always thought that that always stuck out to me. Then I find out that he didn't even intend to do that. Apparently, when he was editing the film, the like good shot he had of Janet Leigh dying, he realized that you could see her take a breath. And so it kind of ruined the illusion for him. So he had to cut away real quick before she took that breath. When he wanted to linger on her die or on her dead body. And so he cut to the shower, then still going, which I thought, oh, that may have been an accident, but it worked so well. Um, and I think that just goes to show how well this film was made because he was able to work with what he had. But yeah, so that's my those are some of the things I really enjoy about the shower scene. I feel like this is one that I could just continue to talk about, but I'm not going to take up the whole podcast episode talking
I
about the shower.
I did want to jump in and say one more thing is after toward the end of that when she's dead, she falls out of the shower. He shows the drain um with
Yes.
the blood going down it until it's kind of clean, and then the superimpose like it shifts so that her eye becomes what we're looking at. And that got me because it's like that moment like you said of knowing she's dead and she's literally just like laying there on the floor and he's just going to clean it all up, you know.
Right.
Like there's humanity in that, but you're also seeing her humanity be violated. And then he pans almost like in one shot, I mean, I'm not sure about the technicality here, to the money on the nightstand. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like the movie is reminding us that this is supposedly the central idea of the movie, but it's not. It's like everybody's obsessed with taking the money and then she wants to give the money back. And then everybody thinks that Norman did this or whoever, she either went off with the money or someone killed her and took the money and they think that Norman did it. And it turns out at the end of the movie, it's stuff that was happening that nobody even knew, right? I mean, it still makes sense because we have the setup, like there's underlying stuff happening throughout the movie that pay off, but it's kind of like that misdirection that, oh, remember this money, but the money then just ends up getting thrown in the back of the car in the trunk with the dead body because Norman didn't even know about it and didn't really care about it. For him it was something else completely that was motivating him. So I thought that was interesting that those shots were kind of connected at the transition point of the movie because the story is transitioning in a really interesting way. And it's almost like, oh, you're going to keep thinking it's about this money, but then everything changes.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that because I do think it is kind of Hitchcock reminding us that, oh, I switched switched this up on you, like this is what you thought it was about, but it wasn't. But it's also kind of another kind of poignant thing when we're already talking about like the humanity and like the sudden loss of her humanity and the violation of that humanity in the shower scene because she's really kind of violated on every level. Um, her privacy is invaded. Her sense of self is decimated. Her body is invaded. Um, so yeah, there's a lot there, but I also find it fascinating because you mentioned it, Mel, in the very beginning, how you're like, there's so much action, like almost a frantic energy at the beginning of the film, and there's something very, I think, and this is also kind of scary too when you really like look at it. Like this movie is kind of like a proto slasher, but slashers often don't like take like it's slashers often aren't about the victims, right? People watch slashers for the killer, mostly the killer and the final girl. Those are the two important figures. The rest of the victims are often just kind of put up to be mowed down, for lack of a better word. But in this one, we spend so much time with her, we get a sense of her life, but we also get a sense of like what is important and what is causing her like worry and anxiety. And I think that's all kind of tied up in the money, because the money for her is kind of, it's tied to this like hopes and dreams of starting over and having this new life, but then also it's her worry and anxiety and guilt that she carries with her. So the money kind of does represent, and like that again, that like frantic energy of those first few scenes of the film. I think all of that is like it's very much reminding us that she was a person who had a whole life. And so then to see it just gone, where now it's just water going down a drain. And then when we see the money feels like it's lost all of that frantic energy. Like I don't know. It just the only way I can think of it is it's like, you have something that's like bustling with energy, and then suddenly there's just silence and static. And then yeah, he does. He gets rid of it very unceremoniously, like he does her body. And so, yeah, yeah, you're very much seeing that it's a life cut short. So I do think that that's important. Um, Before we talk any more about this, I want to talk a little bit more about the gothic elements of this movie, because you mentioned the house. I think the motel itself is a gothic space. I mean, it certainly fits. It's isolated, it's crumbling, it's ruins essentially. Even though the hotel itself is not quite in ruins, it represents this like part of the town, this like arm of the town that died when the highway moved. So in that way we are seeing kind of the gothic ruins. Um and this idea, I think too, that even by the early 60s, this kind of like roadside motel was kind of being replaced too. Because by the time we started seeing highways being put in more places, you know, that's when you start seeing the Howard Johnsons and the Holiday Inns and all the chain ones start to like pop up. So I think these smaller ones were already starting to kind of become a relic of the past. So that absolutely fits with the gothic. But then we have the big gothic house. Like you have this like Victorian crumbling house up on a hill, kind of lording over everything, looking down on, literally casting a shadow on the Bates Motel. And then you have this figure of Mother. Um, in my head, Mother, as we understand her, even though, she is, for all intents and purposes, she is Norman Bates, but um, Mother, if we're talking about her as a separate character, she's this very overbearing feminine figure, which fits in the gothic quite a bit. Um, Also this idea of like being shut up in a house and away from a house like that, away from everybody. I think about like some of the great gothic texts, like William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, where you have just Emily like shut up in this house, and people are going to talk about the old woman in there, or maybe like a Charles Dickens and Miss Havisham, or maybe even something like What Happened to Baby Jane, where you have these like aging women um, who are locked away in these houses for whatever reason. But that's a very big gothic trope. And again, I think Hitchcock was playing with this and also trying to subvert it. So he was doing something different that we hadn't seen before with this particular conceit. But Mel, do you have anything else to offer about like this idea of the gothic elements in this?
I mean, I think the fact that you're bringing up the mother figure is important because I mean, we definitely have a dysfunctional family here. A Rose for Emily, I think. I thought of it when they said that she poisoned her lover and then committed suicide. We find out later that was Norman. Um, But I think you also have the Gothic idea of the return or the ever presence of the past, right? Or the past being carried into the present in some way. I mean, Norman literally takes her out of the ground and her, thinking of all the resurrected bodies, either to become a zombie or taken from the ground and placed somewhere. She kind of is still in the home even though she's dead because he preserved her body, and he's kind of, I guess, tried to preserve her personality himself because he does the voice, and he almost has like a almost makes like a manifestation of his mother, um, that he uses. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, the idea of the mother, the dysfunctional family, the return of the past, um, not being able to let go of the past, the kind of love hate relationship, I guess you would say, between Norman and his mother. It's hard to tell because we're only getting his side of things. I mean, even when she's talking, quote unquote, at the end, is from him. But yeah, those things struck me as very Gothic as well. There's usually like Gothic, or in Gothic, there's usually some sort of like family strife or violence. Um, I mean, this almost touches on stuff that you see in Faulkner too, with like possible incestuous connections as well. So I don't know. The more I think about it, the more that the old house that overlooks the motel is kind of just dripping in almost every kind of Gothic trope you can think of. There's no well, I was about to say there's no twin, but he kind of doubles with his mom, so guess we also have that as well in a weird way.
Yeah, yeah, there is, yeah, I mean, I think we could call it a Gothic doubling. Not quite a twin, not quite a doppelganger, but and I mean, Hitchcock had talked about that, because I think people had talked about the fact that, essentially every time we see Mother or we hear Mother, it is Norman playing that role. And so there's a lot about the idea of like cross-dressing, or is this kind of a transgendered individual. And Hitchcock did speak a little bit about that, because he was like, no, because Norman, in Norman's head, his mother is a separate person from him, right? Like, there's Norman and there's Mother. It's just in a weird way, we're kind of both in his brain. So a split personality might be like closer to what we have. But I do like this idea of calling it like the Gothic twin, because I think um that does kind of fit. Of course, then we do find out that he actually, like, yeah, murdered his mother. I guess because he was afraid of being abandoned, so that maybe this was like guilt too that was coming out, which feels very Edgar Allan Poe, if we're going to talk Gothic. This idea of the compulsion of needing to kill somebody, but then never being able to escape that person. Um, now that you did kill them, so yeah, I think, I think it's very, very interesting. I get a little bit tired, I will admit. I think Psycho does it well, but I do get a little bit tired of feeling like you have a murderer and we're going to blame the bad relationship on the mother. But that's just a personal, I think, preference.
Yeah, it seems like it's just too much of a knee jerk explanation now. Like it's just it's like, oh well, that must be the reason. I had to kind of tell myself that while I was watching it this time. I was like, yeah, I got to take this for what it is and not try to apply everything that's happened since.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think at the time it was not as pushed, but this whole like domineering mother slash mama's boy who can't get out from under the thumb of his evil mom and that makes him do evil things. I do get a little bit tired of it. But I will say Norman Bates succeeds at being, when you're watching the film, I mean, I think you kind of fall into the same trap that Marion Crane does in the film, where it's like, there's something not right, but you don't want to dismiss him completely. Like, he seems like a sweet man. Even though there's like the weird taxidermy and there's nobody else around, and he seems a little too clingy. Um, you want to believe that, like, he's not capable of that. Um, and I will say that I think that the end, when he's talking about, um, like, when he's finally been caught and it's just him alone in the room, and he I guess has been like, mother is there, or he's been taken over by mother, or I don't know how we want to use that language, but when he is like, you know, mother wouldn't even harm a fly, and looks up at the camera, it is terrifying. Like, I remember that ending. It was the shower scene for me, and then it was the ending scene when I first watched it. And of course, you've got like, you realize that mom's been taxidermied too, or essentially she's like a mummified version of herself, which is pretty creepy. Um, but I think that was the moment where it was just, you fully feel how dangerous this man is. Um, Even though all the kind of signs had been there, it's just wanting to dismiss that throughout most of the movie. And I kind of feel like, again, I don't know, I feel like Marion Crane was also in that position of, alarm bells are going off, but you're kind of dismissing it because I'm like, no, no, he really is just a sweet man. Maybe misunderstood, maybe not socially adept, but sweet. And in that end, you realize, oh, this is a very dangerous person. And I don't know, people have made the comparisons to like a Hannibal Lecter or something by the time you get to the end, which I think is, I don't know, I think that's pretty apt comparison.
I know we get a kind of psychological, we have the psychologist who basically like does an info dump at the end and explains to us what's going on. But that scene strikes me as almost like, I don't want to go too far with this, but I think some of the unsettlingness of it and the fear, he, as the psychologist says, in the world of this movie, I'm not saying that this is true psychology, I don't know. He is mother now, like that part has taken him over. And so when we see him, you have the mother side is berating him and saying, I would never do this, and the hurting the fly. So we're getting the side of, oh, this is like the possible guilt, or this is the oh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the punishment or the discipline that he has kept with him. But yeah, when he looks up and smiles at the camera, it's so dark and disturbing. There's almost a possession feel to it. I mean, it's almost like we don't, I mean, to be honest, we don't know who Norman is because of the fact that this was going on inside of him, I guess. But there's almost this idea of like he is fully given himself over to something that is not what he could have been. I mean, but then at the same time, I mean, he did murder the mom and the husband or the lover just because of abandonment issues, which is really disturbing. But that end, it's almost like whatever Norman was or could have been is kind of lost in a way. Not to say he's not responsible for what he did, but like the the transformation, I guess, is complete if you put it that way.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure psychologists today have debunked a lot of this idea of like a split personality, but
Oh yeah, there's a lot of problematic stuff in this too. Like it's a
yeah,
product of its time. We'll
it is
we'll put it
still a
that way.
movie, yeah, that was made in the 1960s. So there absolutely is some stuff that is a bit questionable. But I think it's worth it because it's just a good film, I think. But I also think, like we've been talking about, it's worth it looking at the development at this from the development of the horror genre too. And how so many films we love today could not have happened, I don't think, without the influence of Psycho. Um, and I don't know if we'll ever get a more iconic hotel. Maybe we could push for the hotel in The Shining, but I still think Bates Motel, just because even in our lexicon, I feel like if you pull up to a hotel that is creepy, most people don't say, "Oh, we're at the Overlook." Most people would say, "Oh, it's the Bates Motel." Like that, I don't know, that seems to be shorthand. Bates Motel is shorthand for creepy hotel, and that just I don't know, this is just an iconic film. All right, well, with that, I don't know, I'm actually kind of glad that I don't have any trips coming up because, I don't know. I think you might have turned me off of travel for a while with this one, but we are going to continue this series, listeners. We're going to look at a couple of other creepy motels that came after the Bates Motel and that are a little bit more recent. So join us for those. We are at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. So if you've got any of your own creepy hotels that you want us to look at or that you want to tell us about, please reach out. Our email is nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon. We also have merchandise available at our website, nofearcast.com. Or you can simply rate and review us, which is entirely free, but it does help other listeners find us. Theme music by Nicholas Gasparini. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.